Hello everyone, today we talk about Asiatic heavy cavalry between the 6th and the 11th century. We're talking about a large area of mostly of the western Eurasian steppes, so there's also kind of a European bias here. We'll talk mostly about the Avars, the Magyars, the Khazars, and also the Bulgars, etc. And this in part is connected to the greater documentation that we had from a Western perspective that usually was denser, properly in source production, and also because these peoples were just next door, right? We're talking about the Kipchak in general. We already made a video about Asiatic light cavalry during the same period, so this one goes in tandem with it. Just yesterday we were talking about at least Eastern Eurasian warfare. We made videos about Western, let's say, Western Eurasian heavy cavalrymen or cavalrymen in general between the 12th and 13th century. So there is already some reference I can give you, right? If you want to know more, at least if you want to connect the whole to the dots, right, and to substantiate better the whole picture. So this is properly a military unit type video, and as we've seen often, there is a big deal of material homogeneity in steppes warfare, right? When we talk about Western steppes in general, we look at populations that tended to sedentarize faster than at least the ones that they also had been right in their places of origin. Some of them were mixed, let's say in cultural background, right? You have the Avars were somewhat Turkic, the Magyars were Grofinic, but actually were a much broader mix also of pre-existing Indo-European populations that had blended in. And the result being, however, for a type of warfare was relatively, in fact, homogeneous, a compact picture, like with relatively small differences in their equipment and warfare. Western Eurasian warfare tended as being, not just more, let's say, more fastly sedentarized, but also in this sense to be more influenced already by sedentary civilization warfare. This is the case in, for example, if you look at the Avars when they settled in the late 6th century in the Pannonian Plain. They brought with them what was already a quite advanced military culture. It weren't just the finest horsemen around that introduced also stirrup in Europe, certain type, more elaborate armor, especially the, let's say, at least stopping shock charge capacities and combined armed tactics naturally, but also lots of other things like even the way they set up tents or the beam sling mangonel siege machines. In fact, most of their warfare, this is true also for the later Magyars, was importantly influenced by Middle Eastern military culture, and this is something that they retained also for a very long time in Hungary, to the heart of the Middle Ages. Also because the Silk routes fundamentally ended there, at least some of the branch that passed even through Persia, etc. So there were important contacts with the Caucasus, with the areas of the Caspian Sea, also the ones were inhabited by the Khazar Khanate across the Carpathians, were the steppes properly. This is, it would be interesting to look in detail at all these various peoples that we will do at some point, because they do tend to differ slightly. As we were saying before, when you look at the archaeology, there is the prevalence of maybe even just certain typologies of weapons in different proportions, in this kind of things, certain solutions in their armor. For example, most of these populations, as we were saying yesterday, came de facto, and especially when we're talking about the early Middle Ages, and so what was mostly the Turkic waves, from a Central Asian reality, right? That could be even as far as properly as the East Eurasian steppe, and that in this regard was quite primitive in many ways. There were some changes that are quite important also in the steppes, depending on, for example, whether it were the Indo-European ones, right, that had dominated the Western Eurasia in the previous millennia, and that, with the Turks you have something else. You have probably different type of weapons and of armor, right? But also, and we maybe underestimate this, of course, it was an enormous deal of influence from the sedentary military cultures, also in the development of these troops' panoplies. Right, this is evident among the Khazars that learned, I don't know, for example, riveted plate armor, lamellar armor, at least scale armor from the Byzantines, whereas before they kind of sewn that together in with organic material in a way. These kind of things that can be observed also over the centuries, in spite of the relatively scarce evidence that we have, and sometimes also properly considering we don't know to whom there are certain archaeological finds actually belonged back in the day, because these peoples were also quite tumultuously on the move and kind of clashing, mixing, breaking, falling apart, and so on. So of course it's easier to look, as we were saying in the beginning, mostly at the peoples that eventually sanitarized in a kind of a stable fashion, and especially at in Europe proper, in Central Europe, that were kind of at least more for a longer time better documented than the ones who were just living in Eastern Europe, for example, that we know dramatically less about. So here we will talk about several peoples, and connecting them to certain types of armor, but in general, all these information, all these items were kind of interchangeable at some point. You could find warriors that were a melange of all this equipment. So we'll go by approximation, as necessarily in such this basically half of a millennium of Western Eurasian steppe warfare. So a typical, I don't know, what an avar knight could look like, right? These were really heavy troops. Like these cultures were properly feudal in their own ways. Even if you look at the peoples that inhabited properly the steppe, and so we say, well, these were semi-nomadic, yes, but they did develop some kind of sedentarized forms of of encapsulation, of course, and feudalism, right? So the idea of the knight proper, that is something that even in the late migration era you start seeing properly from these peoples who were kind of had grown robust over the millennia, especially from Central Asia. Now think about the Alans that were probably the easternmost Sarmatian tribe that is, however, the one in the highest with the highest military quality that arrives and brings in properly also in Europe this idea properly of knighthood, of something really heavy and not, I don't know, like the Scythians had somewhat softened up before, right? Because they were coming properly out of the meat grinder, and they had a very big political ethnic cohesion. We talked about the Alans, we made a video about them. Well, these Turkic peoples were similar fundamentally, and the Avars brought together with them a very advanced military culture. So a typical Avar heavy cavalryman would have worn a lamellar corselet, also a typical plumed helmet with cheek guards, right, nasals, eyebrows. So these were, of course, heavy helmets designed to properly protect the warrior in hand-to-hand combat, which the heavy cavalryman was, of course, designed for, most differently from the majority of the rest of the troops that were instead mostly missile, very light in nature, and so they had mostly to be light, right? And so all these reinforcements, the Spangenhelm type, the idea of having this very strong skeleton structure of the helmet that could take some heavy blows and covering the cheeks, reinforcing the eyebrows, etc., from also blows from from the top, where something could slice and cut easily over the helmet surface, and exposing the areas that were of course necessarily open, that thus had been to be reinforcing the rims, was quite of a necessity. He would be armed with a lance, bow, and saber. Saber is appearing essentially in parallel with the Turkic equipment in the West, right? The Iranian peoples had mostly relied on straight swords, and the reason why the saber substituted it is not entirely clear. This could be explained, let's say, at least with the idea of a larger spread of properly lightly, if not completely unarmored, horsemen in larger masses. It would be kind of more typical of the Turkic Altaic warfare of Central Asia compared to the Indo-European one, that was a bit heavier in nature, so that even the heavier cavalry would be better off with something that chopped more than necessarily could inflict damage to armor per se, right? Which still happened, at least in a greater force. I mean, that like a straight sword so that this massive bard could absorb much heavier hits, at least like against a hard target, would could afford in comparison. But it's also a mistake to put it in these terms, because of course the saber had dramatic destructive capacities, and surely there were different types of these kind of weapons. The heavy cavalryman would have been equipped with some of heavier, more massive kind. In any case, the bow also, of course, was the secondary weapon, or even for properly very heavy cavalry. You know that in the steppe, historically the heavy cavalryman and the archer weren't like the shock cavalryman properly, and the archer were not divided at the beginning, and this is something that tended to happen mostly as a tactical diversification in some already semi-sedentarized fashion. This is, for example, in Persia, this is exactly what happened. Like the Parthians had true cataphracts. The Sassanids paradoxically didn't. They lightened them up, right? And also because they relied on more articulated tactical, in combined arms systems, let's say, and so with the multiple tactical specializations could be, could dilute this necessity of hyper, let's say, loaded and trained individual. But in the heart of the steppe, this thing kind of continued for a long time. Here we don't see properly cataphracts among these peoples, meaning I intend cataphract here something completely covered, being horsemen and horse of metal armor. But still, we see, of course, this dramatically high level of individual, rather than, let's say, other than just collective training in these chieftains, which would continue on, given that the broader trend of medieval warfare was towards feudalization. So even when these people settled down, they tended towards something more, they would increase the importance of heavier cavalry altogether, albeit mostly on a Western model, at least as far as the Central European areas were concerned. Also, the typical of these Turkic peoples, the end of the migration here in Western Europe, let's say, is the thumb ring for drawing the bow hanging from his right hand. The length could be it was massive, something like 10-12 feet long. It was held in both hands, and we know, of course, this type of weapon originally adopted from the Sarmatians and Alans by the other Asiatic peoples, because it had been those Indo-Europeans that had first developed that system, right? So it passed through the Turks later on, and this thing is, it's not much about the grip, because you can still use any lengths with both hands, let's say, in combat. But it's properly about the concept of heavy cavalry. It was properly shock functionalized, and therefore the Avars, and eventually and consequently through themselves, the Byzantines, adopted the what in Greek was known as the contest, and it was something that was already there from centuries, right? If not millennia at this point, and that, however, was spreading because of the same spread of this heavier type of cavalrymen. At this point, the Byzantines had also ultra heavy cavalry, right? Something properly they were pioneering also in Europe, the military technology, armors and armor technology of the heavy knight, the cataphracts that they also produced, as you know, in Nicephorian times. In fact, the Strategicon actually records a much Byzantine cavalry equipment altogether in the late 6th century when the manual was written, was based on that of the Avars, that in fact were considered by the same manual as the most advanced of all the barbarians, militarily wise, right? The most dangerous. This is fascinating because, as you know, the Avars would attempt also to storm Constantinople. They had quite a military organization that they compacted, especially towards the 7th century, as quite of a hell of a military machine. And there is, in fact, a broader Avar influence in Byzantine culture that stretches not just from arms and armor, but up to and tents or things like this, but probably even in the administrative model. Some say that the same Byzantine themes were inspired to the our districts, right, in the way they were organized in a also more markedly military sense, right, from this decentralized position, because essentially the Avars were all these. Yes, it was a khaganate, but they were all different clans that were all properly enfeoffed in various provinces where they drew all the enormous resources, by the way, that were necessary to maintain, especially such a heavy cavalry, because the lighter troops could also be drawn easily just by whistling right across the Carpathians. So all the scum of the earth would, in form of unarmored cavalry, would come to raid and pillage, and kind of just paving the road to the heavier bulk, let's say, to the core of our forces. Now, all these steppes peoples had a very sophisticated form of recognition, because in a way, as we've seen, we're all similar. And the belts decorations were something, right? These types of belts were worn by all steppe peoples, and the quality of them indicated the social status, and hence the political and military one, of the owner. Gold for royalty, silver, bronze, brass, in order of descending in the social ladder. And with the number of ornaments on each belt and the number of belts themselves, 2 or sometimes 3 being worn, as a further indication of seniority, and or especially of also properly of recognition, right? It wasn't much of a standardized system per the, let's say, the quality of the material itself, but also some sort of proto-heraldry we can imagine in the symbology of these peoples. And unfortunately, again, we don't have the whole picture. It would be very interesting archaeologically to know more, and there is surely a lot to dig there in certain countries to find out. But all these symbols of rank, like in the gold and silver, etc., decorated other elements of the panoply, the scabbards, the bow cases, the quivers, the sabers, the saddles, the horse trappings, probably even armor, by the way, because we underestimate how even the armor in the Middle Ages was often even colored in some way. Maybe not in this case, I don't know honestly, but as I was saying before, that this is not just a mechanistic, modernized, secularized way of recognizing each other. It was just at the sight of this knight, you would know who they were, right? What kind of character they had, what kind of power they had, who were they? Because, by the way, they they would recognize also each other as a consequence. And these were pagans essentially, gradually either, Christianizing or Islamicizing, some cases also converting to Judaism. Think about the Khazars, etc. And so gradually, becoming something else, losing this symbology that was naturally heavily associated with paganism and so on. But it was this form of recognition was especially in the panoply was typical of the steppe, because in the steppe you couldn't really treasure anything, right? You couldn't say, okay, well, if anything, I will just bury even this stuff and I will come back later to take it, right? These peoples were always on the move. Their political situation was so unstable that carrying everything with them was a primary necessity, and on the battlefield, showing all that power and wealth was a way to just declare that you were investing all your wealth, all your power in that clash, and that was a reason politically and socially for lesser warriors to flock under you, right? If you had hidden that wealth, you would have simply received less troops. And it was literally, you can extend this from a political strategical level to literally the tactical one. By showing off like that, you would show you were someone and something on the battlefield, and therefore giving more security and even inspiring morale and all this stuff. And the surplus was so ridiculous in these cultures that, in fact, it would have been madness to treasure, to preserve some of it, and not invest it immediately in this highly militarized context where basically you could be wiped out from the face of the earth for every minimal weakness, and so you had to always commit your entire forces all the time. We have other armor examples, some dating, for example, from between the 8th to 10th century, showing open-necked lamellar corselets with shoulder pieces, fabric or leather coif, and segmented helmet of splint construction, topped by a plume tube. As these plumes were naturally also very, would have, they were part of the whole show, right? They were, we often underestimate them even in combat psychology, in a sense. They served also some sort of crests in the first place, and they had all that magical, mystical power that we're talking about before. Then the forearms and shins could be protected by leather, vambraces, and greaves. And there were different types of helmets also, with some more marked kind of circular protection. Others instead were kind of, they had a straight rim just over the eyes without any encirclement, let's say. There was some sort of kamae as well, very often. It could be again in kind of either mail or even leather, right? This stuff is debated by some degree, but we think that it was the case. By the way, consider that especially by the very early Middle Ages, the Eurasia was very much of a poor place, right? So that we'll see now there were other materials, even wood, used as armor, as an expedient, because metal was dramatically expensive. So here we're talking properly about the ultra elite, and this is typical of steppes warfare, that you don't really have much of a segmentation, right? You have either ultra heavily armored elite that is also, however, very narrow in numbers, or all the others are pretty much lightly or unarmored troops. And the and it is said the Turks had coming, I don't know, during the 6th to 7th century had made in fact extensive use of leather armor. I don't know on which basis is said archaeologically, frankly, but let's say it's not unrealistic considering just like the costs involved. Of course, not anything that is cheaper and lighter, more comfortable is necessarily what you want to wear in when you really have to take blows that can simply break even actual metal armor and everything that is underneath because of the trauma. There is always some sort of functionality there. It's just that we weren't there. We don't know, right? These materials were usually not preserved, and there are also naturally sources coming from the outside of these cultures, however, representing the same. For example, we have an 8th century Persian evidence of what may represent one of the Khazar so-called Arsiya horse archers. Now, the Arsiya were allegedly a picked unit, a picked corps. We don't know whether they were properly even a tribe within the Khazar Khaganate altogether, or a more floating kind of mercenary foreign guest force that would be replenished every once in a while. Well, the borderline there is quite blurred because what would be the difference between these two things in those times and places. But they were quite important. At some point they even ambushed and destroyed a Varangian force in the 9th century for the Khazars. They were quite prestigious unit. Some said these were in fact Muslims coming from other areas, right, or surrounding ones, even from in fact these more civilized countries. Others believe that there may have been an Alan force, given that the Alan bodyguards were quite a thing from these areas up to Mongolia at some point. Also the fact of being Muslim there is something that could mean all and nothing relatively to the external to the foreign origin of these people, because that the Khazars basically they were actually pagans, and they always remained pagans. It's just that their elite kind of converted largely to Judaism because they were to be to enter the club of Abrahamic religions just to content the Byzantines, that were normally their allies. There was even properly their royalty married into the purple, but some of them actually converted also to Christianity, others to Islam. So there is a debate on what these forces were, but it's still remarkable that a Persian source would talk about them. If you read even the Shahnameh, etc., you have in countries like Persia, etc., this quite strong admiration and reference to peoples living sometimes very far away, and were mostly this Turkic Altaic, ones that the same Shahnameh came to hear about and kind of had integrated, in fact, in its narrative, and that tells you also how much Persia, especially in the northeast, was actually close to the semi-nomadism. So at this point, and it was normal at the time to travel around, right, across these spaces that were, by the way, revitalizing economically as well, along these great routes between the Baltic, the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, etc. And the Persian source documents the RC, as we were saying, as horse archers, with whose armor is described as helmet, mail, and breastplate, probably of lamellar type. So of course there were different strata, right? Mail was kind of a bit the base in this case. Then you would wear lamellar type. Sometimes there were different, even sometimes an extra mail or another, properly larger plate, especially to protect the chest, etc. added. If you look at the Byzantine cataphract at this point, you see they were an ultra heavy, but probably some of basically the heaviest type of cavalry ever created in these let's say early medieval times. That, however, were pretty much similar, if not identical, in the essentials to this other, steps elite panoplies. And for the rest, it's believed that these Arcia troops, especially the heavier type, the Lancers, could be dressed and armed according to some Islamic influence. For example, being dressed even in the styles like Arabs, because actually the Islamic civilization at this point was at its acme, economically, culturally, artistically. So they would, people's dwelling those sides were heavily influenced by them, just like the Byzantines or even beyond. And that would carry shields. In fact, there is a very narrow evidence of shields being used by these ultra heavy cavalry types, as in a sense they were of little use. It's like, in the later Middle Ages, when you have plate armor starts appearing, you see the shields basically came to be always smaller, right? Because what's the point if you are ultra heavily armored? It's not just especially some say that these shields could be a wicker to were just like a little help, a little aid, right, to protect maybe the hand if it was not armored. Some were of wood, naturally, but they were probably relatively small, right? And rather than thinking that they had no shield, it's just we lack evidence of of it in iconography and or archaeology, but this can be explained just by, in fact, also generally speaking, the scarcity of all of the above, and not thinking that they wouldn't have a shield. They would, right? It's just it was probably something just really, really simple, right? Also probably not dramatically consistent in itself. And the Khazars themselves wore tunic, trousers, and long Arab top coats, which, this betrays also the influence that they received from the Middle East, even in certain elements of their equipment. And their principal weapons were spear, saber, and shield, as heavier types. So they also carried a bow, naturally, but the Khazars are said to have relied more on their lances, in a sense, which is interesting because it could betray, again, the influence of a more sedentarized military cultures in the first place, not being particularly, stuck to the older steppes, central steppes models, say Central Asian models. But this also depends on, naturally, how their equipment kind of gradually evolved. And today we don't have time to make, I could make a video to explain in detail, even on the base of every single find that we have, how this change occurred. But naturally the trend is always, as we were saying at the beginning, this gradual, sedentarization. It does change properly in their military culture, in their equipment and tactics and so on. It's not very different from what happened over time to other peoples, like the Scythians had happened before, right? And their actions are similar. Except now in the Middle Ages, the broader feudalization and the some kind of increase in wealth, also in the steppes, by the way, which should never be underestimated, brought to kind of heavier, more advanced and developed hardware than had been seen before, right? Steps technology in arms and armor had improved considerably over time. Then we have a very famous gold vessel dated to the 60s of the 9th century, inserted pictures also here, that is usually described as Magyar, but some say that it could be Pechenek in origin, dated to the first decades of the 10th century. Others say it could be Bulgar, and indeed the question is it even important? Right? They more or less were identical in these kind of equipment, and were all fighting against and sometimes also for each other. So to make too many categorizations is useless. In any case, this is a beautiful picture. The guy wears a splint armor greaves, vambraces, long mail corselet with coif, and his splint armor may be of iron, but some suggest that wood is more probable, right? Wooden foot armor was recorded amongst some other Asian people during this period. We've seen it also yesterday, talking about Eastern Eurasian steppe warfare, so that this was naturally, in part this is being seen as an archaism of some sort, like if you talk about the Siberian forest people, these were still, you find bone, arms and armor, things like these. But generally speaking, if you look at even Byzantine cavalry during, I don't know, the Gothic War in Italy, in the early the first half of the 6th century, it's said that there was no metal around, that it was a dramatically poor situation for which they would have to use wood as armor. And of course that is also affected by a certain degree, and so that not even in emergential situations you could easily find among the elite cavalry, heavy cavalry, this kind of wood armor, right? They were always in an emergency, but in general, if you could afford a wool, body armor in metal, say, of course, extra, for extra elements of the panoply could be a remarkable cost, an extra cost. But let's say, wood is something at least you can always find, and you can also exchange in some situations. If you want to be lighter, for example, this is yet another problem. This heavier cavalry type, of course, was better suited for the end of the clash amongst the horse archers, etc., and to carry out the final and hopefully decisive charge to break the enemy, and right. So, but in other contexts, right, there weren't just you could bet, for example, on a lighter equipment just for the sake of recovering energy, because these are all extra calories that if you put less mass to move there, in can be saved. So never underestimate how economically these people could reason, because that's an aspect that they were properly living on their on the base of their possibilities, which the shortage in resources would render dramatically limited sometimes. So this could be yet another thing. We even find in later medieval times, I don't know, somebody could buy there is always a striking evidence from a Romanian knight of the 15th century who could buy entire, let's say, upper body Milanese armor, so the ultra heavy and theoretically full plate armor, right? Except from the waist down, didn't have any of that. It had yet as if it was unarmored. So that tells you how customized these choices could be, for reasons in that case, of course, were most evidently economical, but that had also and consequently a reflection in the type of warfare that you are encountering, because it's obvious that if you if you don't have enough armor in general in your world, also the type of tactics are going to change as a consequence, right? And so also those who wear armor have to still employ it in ways that are different than in other places. That's part of the reason why even there is in European armor and not only, of course, a difference between, let's say, the Western and Eastern types, right? We would say, why were they, and why is there this divide? Is it just cultural, fashion, artistic? Because the level of armoredness is pretty much the same. It's just that, the structure sometimes is you can say essentially different because again, if this is always the example, like it's even about the sword, right? Is a straight or a curved sword better to kill an opponent? It's like asking whether, in order to kill a mice, it's a white or black cat is better, right? It doesn't make much sense in practice, because in the broader economy of war, that doesn't change virtually a minimal thing. But as far as the individual guy is concerned on the field, of course, he knows what he wants to use that will make him, more comfortable in a way that we can't quite, unfortunately, interview those people anymore to render explicit. But that also was not even just a matter of let's say, of personal taste. It was connected to the broader, production system or whatever. So these may sound foggy speculations, but they're really not, in the sense that they knew better, because the difference existed. It was real, right? It's just that it was minimal, at least minimal for us to care, because we see that, of course, there is difference in armor. It's just that we shouldn't be fooled by the mechanistic and technologistic prejudices to think that in the essentials this would be a big difference, right? The big difference in the field is how first of all, how motivated the entire army was. Secondly, how experienced it was, how trained it was. Secondly, how equipped it was, but in the measure of how many, heavy cavalry you had quantitatively. And again, what was this progressed other, factors, quality in it. And so if they wore, metal armor, wood armor, was it this big deal, right? In their, greaves, was it this big deal? Do you think that will impact decisively the end of, the outcome of the battle? Of course, it's fantasy if you think it does, right? So, but for the sake of wargameism, and many people are fixated about these differences, and should be exposed to sometimes the reality of archaeology that tells us that it was a blend of all these things without any apparent structural, logic, right? That sometimes it could even really be a matter of taste or simple availability or chance, right? And the shields carried this description we made of the 860 AD gold vessel would fit mostly a Magyar context, as we were saying. We know that among the Magyars, shields were carried, and that they were not small, at least not particularly, which is interesting, because as we were saying, instead, kind of steps context, it wasn't quite so much the case. Even in here, it's just hearsay by a certain degree, because the sources cannot really show you directly the evidence of that. As we were saying before, they were, however, probably weaker or hide, and dyed probably in different colors, possibly bright ones that would have had as proto-heraldry. Albeit, we also know that heavier types of shields existed. At the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, we know that that the shields of two captured Magyar chieftains had chieftains had silver cruciform shield bosses, so they were something way more robust. And this is interesting because the Magyars, as you know, had been campaigning a big deal in the West, and part of the reason their shields might have been larger compared to this average kind of Asian, say, background is that they were used to a Western warfare that placed more reliance on the shield and on heavy cavalry in general. If anything, that has a lot to do with the difference with steppes warfare, because it's just said that the degree of armoredness in some cases would also be in a way less need of property of of some kind of shield defense. Well, yes, if it hadn't been that Western warfare probably was more subjected to missile warfare than we think. Sometimes, properly, the Westerners didn't have much of lighter cavalry in the first place, so the need of being, their greater availability, per capita wealth, at least in a more heavily distributed way. That paradoxically, even the steppes was, because even in the West we're talking about feudal warfare, right? But still, there was more armor around. Would, also think about fighting even against another army in the first, or in fact, yes, as it happened, was in this case like against a Magyar one, would mean to be under constant arrow fire. And the horses also weren't quite armored, right? You would say, but then what about this elite instead? What about them? Well, in that regard, they weren't. They had the same problem, in a sense. The point is that missile fire doesn't quite stop cavalry charges per se, right? And my idea is that the elite heavy cavalry in this Asian context, properly heavy cavalry in general, was properly less frequently, especially in a collective sense, involved against other heavy cavalry, right? It happened all the time individually, but this idea of hit and run tactics probably reflected itself in part even in the way heavy cavalry was conceived, differently from the West, so that the Westerners would have this greater proclivity to be more in the melee, right, than others. And also at this point, Western cavalry often dismounted as well, which is something that instead we don't find, at least as often as we understand in these other armies that were much more cavalry based, properly from a quantitative point of view. So this may be just an hypothesis of why this thing of the Magyar shields could have been larger. Surely the Magyars of all these kind of Asian or originally Asian, broadly meant, military cultures were the ones that were the closest and the most similar to the Westerners, right? The Frankish warfare, etc. If anything, by hybridization, given that hybridation, I don't know how to say it in English, they were fighting against the Franks all the time. Albeit still fighting with other peoples in more like the steppe ones in the east as well, right? So they were kind of melange. We also know of those two aforementioned Magyar chieftains captured in Lackfield, that they wore gold collars, probably greavedness, that I don't know if they're connected to the old, Russian unit of measurement. In fact, it's the grivna, and it has to do with properly with metals and so on. Maybe they reflected this, and they surely had this broader magic, symbolic, political meaning, right? A bit like, I don't know, maybe like the torque. I'm just guessing because I don't know whether they were factually the same, but I believe that given the function, they were the same. And also as a protection of some sort. Also typical of the Magyars were the feathers in their helmets, which, however, contained a large patronymic element as well, right? And as we were saying before, more or less all these elements are to be found scattered among all these peoples that we listed. And yeah. So, yes, and I don't know, I think I'm not entirely sure, but I think at some point, of course, we'll get in much closer detail to all these types of troops, equipment in detail, properly in the sense of looking at the single archaeological finds and for each people, like, I don't know, let's pick the Khazars individually and talking about how the whole thing evolved as far as we can see. We're still, Schwerpunkt is still in his infancy, because we're talking about this thing sometimes for the first time still. And so the idea is covering literally everything and all the Eurasian warfare in these terms before passing to something more detailed. But unless it's something more, ad hoc that I create, let's say, beyond this series specifically, something often more discursive, but that, I don't know, we encounter maybe at some point in the discussion of a Pachanic panoply in greater detail, it's possible, but we also have to do it more scientifically at some point. For now, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.